License, registration, or just some good excuses, old man? That's what the young officer sneered as he circled the rusted pickup, chuckling with his partner. The driver didn't argue, didn't even look up. She just kept both hands on the wheel, steady, silent, and scarred. An hour later, a black SUV pulled up, and when the four-star general stepped out, he didn't salute. He pointed at the officers and said 6 words. "You just stopped the woman who trained me." If that hit you deep, comment respect for every quiet legend still walking among us. Sergeant Major, Retimacio Eleanor Vance, 7075, was heading home from the hardware store. Her old Chevy truck rattled with every turn, but it ran because she built it herself. She wore a faded flannel, jeans, and a cap with worn embroidery. U.S. Army Special Forces. No one ever noticed her, and that's how she liked it. That morning, she'd bought parts to fix a neighbor's wheelchair ramp. No charge. A mile from home, red and blue lights flashed behind her. She pulled over calmly, hands on the wheel. 2 young officers approached, one tapping the hood. No plates, no tags, driving a pile of junk. The other smirked. "Probably unregistered or stolen. What do you think, old woman?" Eleanor replied softly. "It's mine since 1968. "Got ID?" She handed it over. They scoffed. "Retired? Yeah, sure." "Sit tight." They pulled her out. One laughed. "You sure you're not hauling moonshine in that thing?" Eleanor said nothing. The officers circled her truck, running their fingers over the dents and rust. Each mark told a story they couldn't read. Afghanistan, 1978. Colombia, 1983. Places that didn't officially exist on any deployment roster. "Step over here, ma'am," one said, the word ma'am dripping with mockery. Eleanor complied. Her movements were measured, deliberate. Years of combat had taught her that resistance often escalated situations unnecessarily. Besides, she had nowhere pressing to be. "What's in the back?" The taller officer gestured toward the lumber and hardware supplies. "Wheelchair ramp materials for Mrs. Clancy down the street." "Sure it is." The officer laughed, sharing a knowing look with his partner. Eleanor's weathered hands bore the calluses of a woman who'd built and rebuilt more than just trucks. They'd constructed field hospitals under enemy fire, emergency shelters during floods, and yes, dozens of ramps for veterans who couldn't navigate their own porches. The sun beat down as they made her empty her pockets. Keys, wallet, a worn photo, a small notebook filled with names, some with stars beside them, some crossed out entirely. "What's this? Some kind of code?" The officer flipped through the notebook. Eleanor simply said, "Names of men I served with." The officer tossed it back to her carelessly. "Well, your truck's not road legal, that's for sure." Eleanor caught the notebook gently, tucking it back into her pocket with the reverence of a chaplain handling scripture. She didn't correct them, didn't explain that her vehicle had a special historical vehicle designation that exempted it from certain regulations. She just stood there, straight back, patient, silent. They made her sit on the curb. People drove by, phones recorded. One officer said, "She's being uncooperative." The other added, "Might be a risk." They called it in. Possible stolen vehicle, elderly female, uncooperative tone. Eleanor just stared at the horizon. In her pocket was a folded letter, a retirement note signed by the Army Chief of Staff. In the glove box, a Bronze Star certificate and a photo of a unit she once commanded. "This is protocol," they told her. "You understand, ma'am?" She didn't reply. After 30 minutes, one of them kicked a tire and muttered, "Bet this lady thinks she's Rambo." A passing teenager snickered, taking a selfie with Eleanor in the background. "Grandpa's in trouble," he captioned it, uploading to social media without a second thought. "Should we check her meds?" the younger officer joked. "Maybe she's forgotten who she is." Eleanor's silence was mistaken for confusion rather than what it truly was. The practiced patience of a woman who had endured interrogations by experts far more intimidating than 2 local officers. An older gas station clerk nearby recognized Eleanor, quietly called someone. "You're not going to believe who they've got on the ground right now." 40 minutes passed. The officers laughed, sipped coffee. One sat on the hood. At minute 59, the wind shifted. A black SUV turned the corner. Government plates, tinted windows. It rolled to a stop. Both officers stood. The back door opened, and a tall man in full 4-star general uniform stepped out. "Which of you stopped this woman?" The midday heat rippled off the asphalt as Eleanor sat, her shadow barely offering relief. The officers had positioned themselves under a nearby tree. Few noticed how perfectly still she sat, how measured her breathing remained, the posture of a woman who had once waited 72 hours in jungle mud for an extraction team. Eleanor's thoughts drifted to similar roads, dusty pathways in Vietnam, where young men with rifles and little training had stopped her. There, respect was often the difference between life and death. The gas station clerk, Mike Henderson, former Army himself, had recognized Eleanor immediately. Mike knew exactly who to call. "General Phillips, it's Mike from Riverside Gas. Sir, they've got Eleanor Vance sitting on the curb like a criminal." "Yes, sir. Corner of Maple and Pine." "Yes, sir. The same Eleanor Vance." The officers grew bored with their catch. The computer showed no wants or warrants. The vehicle wasn't reported stolen, just an old woman with an unregistered truck. "Let's wrap this up," the senior officer said. "Write her for expired registration, improper display of plates, and unsafe vehicle. 3 tickets? That'll cost her nearly $1,000. Rules are rules." They approached Eleanor with clipboards in hand, ready to deliver their bureaucratic punishment when the unmistakable sound of heavy tires on asphalt turned heads. The black SUV didn't creep into position. It arrived with purpose. Government plates, military driver. The officers exchanged glances. "Federal?" one whispered. "Maybe FBI?" Neither guessed correctly. Silence. One officer stammered, We were just..." The general raised a hand. "That man, Harold Briggs, taught me how to lead." Correcting back to the appropriate gender, "That woman, Eleanor Vance, taught me how to lead." "That woman, Eleanor Vance, taught me how to lead." The general's aide stepped forward, carrying a leather portfolio embossed with the presidential seal. He stood at perfect attention beside his superior officer. The black SUV didn't creep into position. It arrived with purpose. Government plates, military driver. The officers exchanged glances. "Federal?" one whispered. "Maybe FBI?" Neither guessed correctly. Silence. One officer stammered, We were just..." The general raised a hand. "That woman, Eleanor Vance, taught me how to lead." The general's aide stepped forward, carrying a leather portfolio embossed with the presidential seal. He stood at perfect attention beside his superior officer. The crowd had grown, drawn by the unexpected appearance of military brass in their small town. One officer blinked. "We didn't know. You didn't ask." The general walked to Eleanor. "Permission to help you up, Sergeant Major." Eleanor stood without help. "Permission granted." Cameras now recorded in silence. The general turned to the officers. "You just disrespected a woman with 3 combat tours and 40 years of service. This truck, it's part of Army history. So is she." The general faced the growing crowd. "This is what happens when we stop teaching respect." The general saluted Eleanor. Eleanor returned it. General Phillips stood ramrod straight, his 4 stars catching the sunlight. The crowd had fallen completely silent, even children sensing the gravity of the moment. "Sergeant Major Vance led the operation that extracted 23 hostages from the Colombian jungle in '86, the general continued, his voice carrying across the gathering. She returned to active duty at age 60 after 9/11 to train special operations units in advanced survival techniques. 3 presidents have shaken her hand. Her mission records will remain classified until 2075. The techniques she developed for high-altitude rescues saved 18 airmen during a classified operation I'm not at liberty to name even now." The general faced the growing crowd. "You just disrespected a woman with 3 combat tours and 40 years of service." The officers looked increasingly uncomfortable. "The truck you're citing," General Phillips gestured to the rusted Chevy. "It transported medical supplies during Hurricane Andrew in '92. Eleanor drove it through 4 feet of water to reach stranded families." A woman in nurse's scrubs approached the edge of the crowd. "Ms. Vance donated blood every month for 30 years, she added. "Never missed an appointment." The officers looked increasingly uncomfortable, shifting their weight from foot to foot. "The truck you're citing," General Phillips gestured to the rusted Chevy. "It transported medical supplies during Hurricane Andrew in '92. Eleanor drove it through 4 feet of water to reach stranded families." The older officer cleared his throat. "Sir, we were just following protocol for vehicles without proper protocol." The general's voice sharpened. "Protocol is built on judgment, officer. Eleanor Vance wrote the protocol for night extractions that's still used by our forces today." A woman pushed forward from the crowd. "That's the woman who built my husband's wheelchair ramp after his stroke," she announced. "Wouldn't take a dime for it." Another voice called out. "She taught my son's scout troop wilderness survival last summer. She delivers groceries to the senior center every Wednesday," added an elderly man with a cane. General Phillips nodded, not surprised. "Sergeant Major Vance never stopped serving, did she?" The general produced a file from his aide and handed it to the senior officer. "This is Sergeant Major Vance's service record, the unclassified version. Anyway, I suggest you both read it before your shift ends today." "As for the truck," General Phillips continued, "it has historical vehicle status granted by the Department of Defense. The paperwork is filed with your department annually. Perhaps you should check records more thoroughly next time." Eleanor finally spoke up, her voice quiet but firm. "General, these officers were doing their job as they understood it. The fault isn't entirely theirs." "Explain, Sergeant Major." "We've created a system where badges and uniforms matter more than the people wearing them, where protocols replace judgment. I saw the same mistake in Vietnam. Young men following orders without context." The general nodded slowly. "Always the teacher, aren't you, Harold?" Correcting back to the appropriate gender. "Always the teacher, aren't you, Eleanor?" "Always the teacher, aren't you, Eleanor?" For the first time, Eleanor smiled slightly. "Until they put me in the ground, sir." The general produced a file from his aide and handed it to the senior officer. "This is Sergeant Major Vance's service record, the unclassified version, anyway. I suggest you both read it before your shift ends today." The officer accepted it with a chastened nod. That afternoon, the sheriff's department issued a public statement. The incident made national news. Legendary veteran detained. General defends former mentor. Donations flooded in from across the country, $247,000 within the first week. Eleanor directed every penny toward building wheelchair ramps for disabled veterans nationwide. The Eleanor Vance Initiative was established with a waiting list of over 300 homes needing accessibility modifications. The young officer, Brian Keller, correcting the name from the original text's Brian Keller to reflect the character's general usage, didn't just apologize and disappear. He began volunteering at the VFW hall on weekends. At first, the veterans eyed him suspiciously, the cop who disrespected one of their own. But Eleanor's acceptance gradually opened doors. The local sheriff implemented a new training program, recognition and respect, making the incident a mandatory lesson. Months passed. The young officer, Brian Keller, didn't just apologize and disappear. He began volunteering at the VFW hall on weekends. "Why did you really come back?" Eleanor asked him one evening as they repaired a leaking roof at the hall. "Because I realized I knew nothing about the people I swore to protect," Brian admitted. 4 years on the force, and I never once visited this place." General Phillips returned 3 months later, this time without ceremony or uniform. He and Eleanor sat on the porch of her modest home, sharing whiskey and watching fireflies. "You turned it around, Eleanor, like always." Eleanor shook her head. "They turned it around themselves. All they needed was a mirror." The sheriff implemented a new training program, recognition and respect, for all new recruits. Eleanor reluctantly agreed to speak at the first session, where she said just 11 words. Service doesn't end with the uniform. Neither should the respect for it. The truck still rattles down Main Street every morning, carrying lumber and tools. But now, police cruisers pull over when they see it coming. Not to stop it, but to salute it. And at the police academy, every new recruit reads a laminated card with 6 words. You never know who you're stopping.